Hello everyone, my name is Laura and I'm the Marketing and Library Relations Officer at Open Book Publishers. Today with us we have Montserrat Gomendio and José Ignacio Wert, authors of Dire Straits-Education Reforms, Ideology, Vested Interest and Evidence, an open access title that compares educational policies around the world in order to understand what works and where. This title is available to read and download for free at www.openbookpublishers.com. Before beginning the interview, I would like to introduce our interviewees. So today with us we have, as I said, Montserrat Gomendio, who's an evolutionary biologist by training and who holds a bachelor degree from the Universidad Complutense in Madrid and a PhD from Cambridge University in the UK. She is a tenured research professor at the Spanish Research Council and was director of the Spanish National Science Museum and vice president of the Spanish Research Council. In 2011, she was appointed Secretary of the State of Education by Vocational Training and Universities at the Spanish government, and later in 2015, she joined the OECD as Deputy Director of Education. Well, 2 years after, in 2017, she became the head of the OECD Skills Center. In 2020, she also co-founded and has since co-chaired Skills We Go, a consultancy in education, training and employment. Montserrat has also authored many books and over 100 publications in peer-reviewed scientific journals. Thank you so much for being with us today, Montserrat. Also with us, we have José Ignacio Wert, who holds a law degree by the Universidad Complutense in Madrid and a master's degree in political sociology by the Instituto of Estudios Políticos in Spain. He has been Deputy Director of the Center for Sociological Research and founder and CEO of Demoscopia, which is a leading polling firm in Spain, serving as well in different managing capacities in other private ventures. From 2011 to 2015, he was Minister of Education, Culture and Sports in the Spanish government, and from 2015 to 2018, he was the Ambassador of Spain at the OECD. In 2020, he co-founded and has since co-chaired Skills We Go together with Montserrat. He's also author of 4 books and co-author of over 24 publications, plus several hundred articles in journals and magazines. He has recently published a book which is called La Educación en España, Asignatura Pendiente, which was his latest release in 2019. Well, after this brief introduction, thank you so much for being with me today. So yeah, without further ado, I would like to start with my first question, which is addressed to Montserrat. So Montserrat, why did you write this book? What was the idea behind it?
So thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation to do this interview. So as you explained, we both joined government and we were responsible for designing, getting approved by Parliament and implementing an education reform, which was very ambitious. And we learned through that process about all the obstacles that education reforms face, which normally remain hidden from the public debate. As you also mentioned in the introduction, we then joined the OECD with different roles. So we had the opportunity to advise governments all over the world, and that made us realize the extent to which both the success of certain policies and the costs of implementing certain policies are different between countries. So we decided that we were not comfortable with the widely accepted narrative about why education reforms are so difficult, which is either that they have high political cost in the short term, but the benefits only happen in the long term, and therefore education ministers don't bother, basically, or that there is lack of consensus, and therefore this makes education reforms impossible. Our experience led us to believe that it's a much more complex combination of factors. So in the book, we look at governance arrangements, whether in centralized versus decentralized systems, there are differences in relation to who makes the decisions, who raises the funding, who uses the funding, and how this hinders or facilitates education reforms. We look at ideology. We look at conflicts of interest with stakeholders, and we look at the impact of evidence. So we come up with quite a different explanation from previous explanations. Yeah.
Well, that's definitely a very round and complete approach to it. I also wanted to ask you, why do you think some education reforms are more difficult to implement or to have than others?
Yeah. So when we were in government, it was just at the peak of the financial crisis in our country, in Spain, and the government implemented many different reforms. So we were able to experience very closely the difficulties associated with different types of reforms. We have come to the conclusion that one of the reasons why education reforms are so difficult is that they imply generally a huge redistribution of resources. So obviously public education systems need a huge amount of investment, but many reforms change the way these are redistributed between different stakeholders or between regional governments and central government. And this leads to very intense conflicts of interest. The problem is these are the beneficiaries of the resources, but the beneficiaries of education reforms that intend to improve student learning are obviously their students and their families. And they are not organized in any country in any way that makes them powerful, that allows them to have any bargaining power. And therefore, most of the bargaining power is held by stakeholders who tend to reject education reforms if they feel that the resources that they receive are threatened because of this reform, basically. If you compare it with labor market reforms, they're also very complicated and difficult, but you have on the one hand employers and on the other hand workers. They are both organized in ways that make them powerful in negotiations, and this doesn't happen in education.
Thank you so much, Montse, for this explanation on the issue and difficulties faced when trying to implement education reforms. So my next question would be to our next guest, José Ignacio. José Ignacio, how do you think ideology affects general education reforms?
Well, ideology affects educational reforms in many ways and very often. And to begin with, we have to recognize that there are deep and legitimate differences over many aspects of education that are grounded in ideology. Because values and beliefs of ideological nature are both part and reflection of educational theories and doctrines. And it would be naive to expect them to be absent from the education policy debate. There is no problem with this. I mean, these conceptions of education are grounded in wider political orientations, and they will translate into different approaches to key aspects of education policy making. For instance, in general, leveling in parties and governments would be in favor of a very strict meaning of public education, implying that education is not only funded but also managed by political authorities. Instead, parties and governments leaning to the right would probably in most cases advocate for more parental choice and for a private social delivery of education with less involvement of public authorities into it. Even the definition of the main purpose of education has ideological implications. For instance, the left will be putting equity as the top priority, while the right will be more oriented to human capital development. So, insofar as different ideological options are openly and honestly presented in the education debate, made explicit and people openly talks about the ideological roots of the educational conceptions, I don't think that would fatally hinder performance-oriented education. However, the problem arises when a legitimate ideological argument is not presented on its own merit, but rather disguised as something evidence-based, something related with educational outcomes. Also, it could be more complicated because sometimes it's not only that an argument which is not based on evidence is presented but based on evidence, but also that there are some vested interests that are relevant to important educational stakeholders, and they are kind of traded with political operators to get some advantages. I think that class size reduction is a very telling example of this. Reduction of class size is a permanent fixture in teachers' unions' demands. Also, some parties would tend to back this demand because it's a very safe bet. So far as an overwhelming majority of parents think that the reduction of class size automatically translates into more quality in the education process. However, this is not backed by evidence. There is no link about the reduction of class size and the better learning outcomes. It depends on many contextual factors. So hiding this reality, the reality that there is no such link, or even presenting sort of a counterfactual of that reality, saying that there's some evidence providing the information that reducing the class size means improving the quality of education is a very disingenuous use of ideology, and also could be also a disingenuous use of vested interest.
Thank you so much for that insight and that aspect. My next question is, are there examples of education reforms agreed upon by different political parties which have overcome ideological divide?
Yeah, there are some, and the book will refer to some examples of these broadly shared agreements transversal to the political spectrum regarding some central education policies. Perhaps one of the first ones which comes to mind is the example in the United States of the No Child Left Behind Act, the Act on Elementary and Secondary Education in the United States that was passed by a overwhelming majority in both houses of Congress, in the House of Representatives and the Senate, more than 90%, and that was sponsored by Democrats and Republicans alike, and really that brought about an improvement in the overall quality of the American education system. Another very good example, which refers to an aspect which, as I said before, is central in the education policy debate, which is the role of families in choosing the school they want their children to attend to, has been dealt in the UK over the past 20 years or so with some sort of silent agreement. The policy of replacing low-performing modern comprehensives managed by local authority by academies, managed by private or social sponsors, was first designed and began implementation under Labour government with a very important role of Andrew Adonis as the main author of this reform. And then it was further developed by the coalition government, and finally it has been almost completely implemented by a Tory government. Today, 80% of the secondary schools in the United Kingdom, but in England, are either academies or free schools, and 79% of the students attending them are in those academies. So it has been a complete reversal of the system managed through 20 years with some, as I said, silent agreement of the main political parties. Also, without leaving the English-speaking world, well, basically English-speaking world, is the Republic of Ireland. In the Republic of Ireland, there's some cleavage regarding basically moral values and religious values. And there's some sort of silent consensual agreement, which means agreeing on the basics and letting themselves disagree on the accidental, so that when a government changes, the basics of the system remain the same, and the changes go to accidental. Also, we can find examples in Nordic countries like Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Norway, in Belgium, in the Netherlands. So there are some examples, but I would say that all in all, these are rather exceptions than the rule. In many, many countries, it is difficult to build up a bulletproof consensus on education that really shields the basics of the education system from the changes in the political balance, in the political equilibrium of societies. So that ideology makes it difficult or even impossible to reach consensus. Also, it is important to say in this regard that the idea that education law should never change is nonsense. I mean, education policies and education laws should and must change according to changes in environment, changes in the object of education, new avenues open to education, to students and teachers by technology or by other factors. So the thing is that it would be very convenient to have, let me put it this way, the political intelligence to shield the basic elements of performance-oriented education reforms from ideological difference. That would be being able to build up agreements, including agreements on disagreements, to really keep the ideological roadblocks at bay and progress with performance-oriented education reforms, because normally those ideological aspects are not central to policy making on the basics of education.
Thank you so much. That's a very insightful approach to how this kind of balance between governments, and how do you get that lasting effect towards political education and reformative education. So yeah, thank you so much for that. So my next question will be actually go back to Montserrat, if that's okay. So the question would be, why has the evidence from international surveys, such as, for example, PISA, not had the expected impact on improving the education systems?
Yeah, so we analyzed that in a lot of detail, because the expectation that we all had was that when we had an international survey like PISA, and there are others like Pearls and Timms, but PISA was more focused on providing policy recommendations, that this evidence comparing education systems between different countries and drawing lessons from top performing countries would help education systems improve. And the fact, according to PISA's own data, is that after 20 years, most OECD countries, I would say most PISA participating countries, which is a much larger group of countries, have not improved. So the question is why? And we analyze this in quite a lot of detail, because again, the simplistic explanation is, coming back to my previous answer, is, well, ministers of education don't bother because of the political cost now and the long-term benefits. We don't think that's the case, or at least not the full explanation. So if you look at the evidence closely, there is a block of variables which have to do with investment, which, as I explained, is a huge amount of resources that the state gives out to regional or local authorities and to schools in order to keep the public education system going. And this goes mainly into teacher salaries. Now, what the evidence say is that above a certain threshold, more investment per se has no impact whatsoever on student outcomes. Now, this very solid evidence has had no impact whatsoever on policymaking, because in most countries, after the financial crisis, investments in education have continued to increase. And if you look at student outcomes, they don't improve as investments in education increase. Even if you look within countries and you look over time, when investments in education go up, student outcomes remain stagnated. So we think, very, very briefly, but the argument is a bit more complex, but explaining very briefly, we think this has to do again with conflicts of interest. If you don't continue to increase investment, then there are a number of stakeholders that are very powerful that are going to be disappointed by the fact that they're not going to increase the resources they receive, or even fear that those resources are going to decrease. And in that case, they're going to reject it. And the evidence plays no role whatsoever. So the idea that evidence will always override ideological divides or conflicts of interest, when these conflicts of interest are so intense, it's really not the case. I mean, it's sad, but the conflicts of interest override the evidence. Is the other way around. Then there's another block of variables which have been very influential, such as school autonomy, which is a policy recommendation that many countries have followed, which is very, very context dependent, because school autonomy only leads to better student outcomes when it's implemented together with accountability. But also, it only leads to better student outcomes in education systems that have already reached a high level of quality. So when you make this recommendation universal and it is adopted by countries which either don't have accountability mechanisms or where the education system has not reached a certain level of quality, autonomy is going to have the opposite effect. It's going to have a negative impact on student outcomes. And the last block is a block of variables which has to do with equity. And here we argue that some of the policy recommendations are flawed. And the reason is very complex, so I won't try to explain. But, part of the reason is that while quality is easy to measure, it's just student outcomes. Equity, you can measure it in many different ways. And depending on the variables that you use to measure it, you come to very different conclusions. So we do a very deep dive into the different variables that could reflect quality and what they say and why we think that some of the policy recommendations are flawed.
Well, thank you so much for that answer. My next and final question is also from Montserrat. So it would be, which are the real top performing education systems and what are the lessons that we can draw from them?
Yeah. So again, we think the narrative has been a bit oversimplistic. I mean, because in the first cycle of PISA, which is PISA 2000, which had a small group of OECD countries, PISA, Finland came the top performer in reading. And I emphasize reading because it wasn't the top performer in neither maths nor science. Then Finland has become a legend. And all sorts of conclusions have been drawn from what Finland was doing at the time in the year 2000, and then, try to transfer those policies into other countries. And basically, the narrative around Finland is what it's really important is that the systems are comprehensive, that there are no different trajectories for students like vocational education and training and the academic track before the end of compulsory education, that schools have a lot of autonomy and teacher excellence. Now, the problem with Finland being the legend and the perception that it is the superpower, which still remains today, is that after the first cycle of PISA, Finland's results in terms of student outcomes started to decline and have been declining ever since. So we argue that there's something wrong with that interpretation, or that the context in Finland has changed and these rules do not apply to other systems. So what we think are the real superpowers are countries in East Asia. Very little attention has been paid to what they have done, although these countries are very interesting because rather than starting from a very good point and then declining like Finland has done, they have a very difficult starting point several decades ago. I'm talking about Singapore and South Korea, almost illiterate societies. In a few decades, thanks to the education system and thanks to the way it has evolved over time, they have become the superpowers to the extent that they literally are in another galaxy, in the sense that cycle after cycle, they continue to improve and there seems to be no ceiling. If you compare what they're doing or what they've been doing over these decades, because as I said, they evolve, so what they do changes over time as the system improves, with the conclusions drawn from Finland, they don't match. They don't have school autonomy, and they didn't start by having comprehensive systems. They started by having early tracking when the student population was very heterogeneous. So we argue that we should pay more attention to what works in what context, and that low-performing countries tend to be very different from Finland and perhaps more similar to what Singapore and South Korea were some time ago. There is one thing that they do share, which is excellent teachers. But again, in East Asia, the political cost of implementing all the mechanisms that are necessary to get an excellent teaching force are never rejected because the unions are not very powerful. You go to other regions like Latin America, where teacher quality is much lower. Many efforts have been done to try to improve teacher quality, but it always gets a very strong rejection from the unions, which defend their members, which currently tend to be teachers with a low level of skills, and therefore they defend the status quo, and they don't want to implement any measures that make it more demanding for teachers or mechanisms that implement accountability mechanisms that are present in East Asian countries and so on. So the lessons drawn from top performers, I think that we think the narrative also has to change, and we need to move away from this idea that Finland has the solution to everybody's problem, and look at other countries that have improved over time, and look at what have they done over time and how they've changed and adapted to new circumstances.
Well, those are very interesting cases, especially to what you say, to explain how that growth in contextuality is really key to this kind of approach. So thank you so much. And well, that's we got to the end of the interview, but thank you so much for being with me today. I really appreciate it. And for those who are watching, this book is an open access title, so available to read by anyone everywhere. So please download your copy, and it will be in the description box below as well. Thank you so much.